Hey, hello class, and welcome back. It's History 200. You're in the basement of Professor Santangelo's house, and we're going to give this another try. So this is the first of two lectures for Tuesday, April 12th. This will be an hour plus, and then there'll be a second one you can watch after you've had time to take a break. Okay, so when we left things off last class, we had finally, after almost a decade's worth of hemming and hawing and fussing and starting, come up with a document that is going to be the basis for this new government of ours. So the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, and the first elections under the Constitution happened in 1788 with the first Congress and the first president being inaugurated and sworn in 1789. The first president, of course, is going to be George Washington. The first Congress is the first Congress. Um, it's worth pointing out that even though this new government is underway, that a lot of people are still pretty scared of it, a little nervous about it. Early on in the first Congress, James Madison, who of course is one of the creators of the Constitution, one of the lead guys, who was a member of the House of Representatives at the time, in a speech made a reference to the national government, and his opponents leaped and jumped up and down and said, "There is no national government. You should know better than that because the Constitution is your baby. It's the federal government. If you call it a national government, that implies that there's only one government for the whole country. And actually, we've got a central government and then state governments, and we have delegated powers to each." And they made him apologize on the floor of the House of Representatives, which gives you some idea of just how nervous they are. Everything they're doing is new. This is all an experiment. They're not sure it's going to work. And if it doesn't work, there's a lot on the line because they're trying to make a republic work, and it had never worked before. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about presidents, and it's worth pointing out that that's not what they would have expected. Congress was supposed to be really the strong part of the three branches of the federal government because it creates the laws. They assumed that that was the most important part. And in reality, Congress really was the dominant branch of the three branches of government for really well past the part of the American history that I'll be talking about. But presidents are going to be important for a number of reasons. First of all, presidential elections are going to be key moments in which important decisions are made about the direction of the country, and presidents are also agenda setters in ways that individual members of Congress often are not, although there are important members of Congress who I'll mention from time to time. But still, you're going to hear about all the presidents, even poor William Henry Harrison, who's only president for 6 weeks. You're going to get them all, everybody up to and including Lincoln, who's the last one before we leave our semester. Um, they're not all important, but their presidencies matter, and the elections that elect them are all going to be important about the direction of the country. Now, of course, George Washington is the first president elected in 1788 to no opposition. Who's going to run against George Washington? And his vice president is John Adams, who we've heard for already, and we'll hear more about subsequently. So, Washington is the first president of the United States, and the idea of an elected head of state is something that they're tiptoeing into. And he, in particular, was very concerned about what was going to happen and what sort of precedents that he was going to set for the people who came after him. So, there's a lot of nervousness on his part, as well as some questions about just sort of how to handle his role and what a president truly is. So, one question that came up very early is how does one address the president? So, not that you'd be seeing the president's motorcade come by, and certainly you're not going to be likely to have a visit from the president anytime soon. But if you were to write a letter or an email or even a text message, I guess, or address a tweet to the president, how does one address that? If it's the king, there's certain things you say, Your Majesty, Your Highness, and so forth. So there's a discussion. How does one address the president because they're not a king? So some people offer His Elective Highness or His Elective Excellency. John Adams, the vice president, believes that when you write a letter to the president, it should be addressed to His Highness, the elected authority of the United States and protector of the rights of the same, which doesn't exactly flow off the tongue, and I probably didn't even get it right. But it doesn't matter because that's not what we call the president. He was trying to emphasize the importance of the job, a job that he hopes someday to have himself, and to make sure that people understand when they're addressing the president of the United States, they're not addressing the president of the local chess club. That said, however, that's a little pretentious, and a lot of these other ideas were pretentious. And eventually, the less pretentious branch of Congress, the House of Representatives, the one that more directly represents the people, because there are more of them and they come from local districts, the more egalitarian branch of Congress, someone there suggested, how about we just refer to the president as Mr. President? Someday Ms. or Mrs. President, we'll get to that. It didn't occur to them back then, but certainly someday, presumably in our lifetimes, I'm sure very soon, in fact, there will be a Madam President, a Ms. President, a Mrs. President, a Miss President, whichever it may be. For now, Mr. President is what they came up with, and that is okay. That's if you want to write a letter or an email or send a tweet to the president, refer to the president as Mr. President. You're on solid ground. That took a month to decide because they wanted to be sure they got it right. And everything that they're deciding about the president, they need to make sure that they're going to get it right because they know that other presidents will follow and other administrations will be learning the lessons of these early precedents. So, another question that came up, should the president's birthday be celebrated as a holiday? Washington was firmly against this idea. He is the most beloved man in the country, and yet it was very clear to him that he did not want to be treated like a king. His goal was to serve his term, or as it turned out, 2 terms, and then go back to Mount Vernon, just be a regular guy, a regular rich guy who owned hundreds of slaves, has one of the biggest plantations in Virginia. But anyway, putting that aside, he wants to be just treated like a regular American, like anybody else. And the idea of having his birthday celebrated as a national holiday, he absolutely put his foot down and said, no, thank you. After he died, the president's birthday, the first president's birthday, got turned into a holiday. Washington's birthday was a national holiday that eventually, in the 20th century, got merged with Lincoln's birthday into President's Day. But when if Washington came back and saw all the ads on TV where people dressed up as him and people dressed up as Lincoln are trying to sell cars and laundry and Lord only knows what else during the President's Day sales, he would flip his wig, possibly literally, because that would have really bothered him. He did not want to be treated anything like a king. Absolutely not. On the other hand, Washington did understand that he was a pretty important guy. And another question that arose in his first term was who is more important, the president of the United States or the governor of a state? Now today that seems like a pretty obvious question because the president is the president of all the states and a governor is the governor of just one state. However, given the federal system and the sharing of power, this is something that has to be worked out. And it was worked out in sort of a strange way, kind of a weird etiquette way. Early in Washington's first term, he was invited to a celebration in his honor up in Massachusetts. Of course, he was delighted to go there and see some of his old friends and talk over old times about the Revolution and the war and all the terrible times that they had before they finally pulled their bacon out of the fire. And sure, absolutely, accepted the invitation. He and his retinue from New York, which was the capital originally, headed up to Boston, checked into their hotel, and then they have a while before they have to go to this event that's going to be held in his honor. And during that time, of course, while he's in his hotel room soaking his feet or whatever he's doing, a lot of the important people in Boston came to pay their respects because it's not every day the president of the United States, plus the father of your country, shows up in town. So, the mayor shows up and local congressmen show up and the head of the city council shows up and all these people show up and they all thank him for coming. Thank you, Mr. President. We're delighted to have you here, which is a mark of respect. And it's showing respect toward authority. But as they get closer and closer to when Washington has to leave for his event, he realizes that there is one person who had not shown up to pay their respect. And that's the governor of Massachusetts. Again, it's John Hancock. John Hancock is the governor of Massachusetts. He is in Boston. He's in the State House. That's just down the street from where he's going to be. And Washington thinks, oh, it's kind of rude that the governor hasn't shown up to, pay his respects the way all these other people did. Well, it turns out that Governor Hancock was sitting in his State House office waiting for Washington to come to him because Hancock believes that the proper etiquette is Washington as a guest. This is my state, and therefore Washington needs to come directly to me and thank me for inviting him. But Washington was having none of that. And there's a little bit of a tug of war that goes on between these two very strong-willed men. Some messengers go back and forth. When's Washington coming? When's Hancock coming? It becomes clear that neither one of them wants to budge, and Washington refused to go to the actual dinner in his honor until Hancock had actually come and paid his respects. Hancock didn't do that. Washington skipped the dinner. Very embarrassing because he doesn't show up in the dinner in his honor. It's not embarrassing for him. It's embarrassing for everybody who threw the thing. They know he's in town. A lot of them have already seen him earlier, and they find out the story is that Washington refused to come to the dinner because Governor Hancock did not show him the proper respect. And everybody's pretty mad at Governor Hancock for blowing their opportunity to celebrate George Washington. And the next day, Hancock went to the hotel room and apologized and thanked President Washington for coming. At that moment, setting another precedent. Who's more important? The president of all these United States is more important than the governor of just one state, although in some specific cases, the governor may have more direct authority over you and me. But still, president is the president of the whole United States. Again, took a little while to decide. Now, one last thing that they had to determine, and there are many, many things. Basically, every time George Washington sneezes, he's setting a precedent about what presidents will do. But one last area worth mentioning is that the President of the United States is given in the Constitution the authority to run the foreign policy of the country, which previously didn't exist under the Articles. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no single national foreign policy officer. Instead, the different states had their own policies toward each other and toward the rest of the world. Trade policy, international policy, diplomacy, all that. Nothing was handled centrally. Well, during the Constitutional Convention, one of the things that they changed was to make sure that there was a central foreign policy authority, and that's in the president's aegis. So the president and the president's aides will set the foreign policy for the country. But as part of the checks and balances that had been created, written into the Constitution, in this case, foreign policy is very important. It's key to get it right, and it's key to make sure that the president gets enough good advice so that he, or someday she, doesn't go around running off half-cocked or making terrible decisions. So therefore, as part of the checks and balances, the president's foreign policy decisions have to get the approval of the Senate, which is the upper chamber of the Congress. Specifically, the phrasing in the Constitution says that the Senate shall advise and consent in the foreign policy makings of the president. Well, that language is pretty vague, and it wasn't really clear what that really meant. Does that mean that the Senate is a full partner? Does that mean that the president will sit down with the senators or maybe a key group of senators whenever making foreign policy decisions? Does that mean that everything that he decides to do for foreign policy they have to vote on? It wasn't really clear. Early in Washington's presidency, and he took the idea of foreign policy and his responsibilities there very much sacred to him. Early in his presidency, he is beginning the process of this foreign policy project by an important job, which is appointing the ambassadors to the key countries of Europe. Probably a little bit easier in those days because there weren't that many different countries. He's not appointing ambassadors to anywhere in Asia or Africa. He's just sending people over to Europe because those are the only countries that the U.S. really cares about. But anyway, so he's got a handful of ambassadors that he's appointing. And when he appoints these ambassadors who are representing the United States in the capitals of those other countries, and without the kind of constant communication that we have today, he needs to make sure that they have a lot of specific instructions so that they can speak for him and therefore for the whole country when they go off to, whether it's England or Paris or wherever. So he's writing down instructions for each of these ambassadors that they can take with them to guide them as they try to set up good relations with whichever country that they're going to be sent off to. And then he remembered, okay, the Senate has to advise and consent on what I'm going to be coming up with. And so therefore, he realized before he was going to send these letters to the ambassadors before they got on their ships and headed across the Atlantic, he needed to get the advice and consent of the Senate. Well, as it happens, as I said, the capital at the beginning, the first headquarters, the first seat of the national government is in New York. They knew that was temporary. They had to figure out where they're going to eventually show up. But at first, all three branches of the federal government are in the same building in Lower Manhattan. So, the Senate's just around the corner from him. Their offices are, just a few doors down from where he's writing these letters. And so Washington took the drafts of these letters and he went to the Senate chambers. And so there's a few dozen senators who are doing whatever they're doing, minding their own business, picking their noses or whatever they're doing, debating about this, that, or the other. And President Washington walks in and he says, "Hey, fellas, you got a minute?" And they say, "Oh yeah, sure, absolutely, President George, whatever. Yeah, absolutely, your worshipfulness. Oh yeah, Mr. President. What can we do for you?" And they say, "Well," he says, "Well, I've got these letters, and I need to send them to these ambassadors to get us started on the right foot for foreign policy. And you're supposed to advise and consent on what I do." And they say, "Oh yeah, yeah, I got that." So then he stands before the group of senators and he pulls out the first letter and he begins to read it. And he finishes a paragraph, Ambassador Jones, who's going to London, the first thing that I want you to do when you get to London is blah, blah, blah. He finishes that paragraph and he looks up at the group and he says, "Do you so advise and consent?" And it sounds good to them. So, oh, yeah, nod their head. Yeah, sure, sounds good, President. Um, he goes on and reads the next paragraph. "The next thing I want you to do is blah, 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 blah." He reads that paragraph. He looks up at them. "Do you so advise and consent?" And it sounds good to them, absolutely. He's got pages and pages of these, and that's just the first one. And he's got one for another ambassador and another ambassador, and he keeps looking up periodically to get their feedback. And honestly, they haven't thought that much about a lot of this stuff, and they don't have a lot to say about it. And even when they do, they're sort of small, tinkery things. Did you spell that word right or whatever? Um, and it takes hours for him to get through in this slow, laborious fashion these letters that he believes, according to the Constitution, they have to consent to him, to how he's written it. And it's ridiculous because he doesn't really get any feedback from the Senate at all, really wastes everybody's time. And when it's over, he goes back into his office, slams the door, I'm sure had a few choice words, and said, "I'm never doing that again. That was a big waste of my time." And so if the senators have a problem with the foreign policy decisions that I make, they can tell me. And that effectively sets how foreign policy for the US is made. The Senate has oversight over foreign policy. So the president, not him, but people who work for the president, especially in the State Department, which is the branch of the federal government that's engaged in foreign policy, they will be called in from time to time by senators, by committees in the Senate, people in the State Department, whether the Secretary of State or people who work for the Secretary of State. And then there will be hearings or questions, or there'll be some feedback that happens from the senators, but that's oversight. It's what is the plan? Why did we do this? Where do we think we're going after this? And so forth. It's not really a direct partnership. The president sets the tone, sets the agenda for foreign policy, and then the Senate can come in and say, "Listen, we don't think this is a good idea," or "Let's work this out." But most of those decisions, especially the momentary decisions, the day-to-day decisions, they're going to be made by the president and the president's staff. And the Senate has an advisory role, but is not an equal partnership. Didn't have to be that way. Constitution was vague, but because President Washington was humiliated by this slow, laborious, torturous process of reading these letters to the senators, he basically decided, "I'm just going to do this myself and set the tone, and you guys in the Senate can let me know if you've got a problem with it." Okay, well, fair enough. All right, President Washington really thought that the way the Constitution worked, that his responsibility, his main responsibility, was indeed to make sure that the foreign policy stuff was taken care of. He was a little more nervous about getting directly involved in what we call domestic policy, which is the stuff that's happening within the country. As far as he was concerned, the way he interpreted things, that really was more the responsibility of Congress and then the states. But it turns out that the president in the executive branch, more specifically, does have an important role to play in domestic policy. If the president isn't going to do it, then other people in the executive branch are. And it turned out that the key guy here is President Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. First of all, I've mentioned Hamilton previously. Um, And yes, this is the same Hamilton from the famous Broadway play, which, like every other Broadway play, has been shut down. But we'll get to see it again someday. In the meantime, you can listen to the soundtrack. So Hamilton, quick biography of him. Hamilton, in some ways, would seem like an unlikely person to wind up in such an important job in the United States. First of all, he wasn't born in North America. He was born on a small island in the Caribbean. His father, he never really knew, but was pretty sure that it was a sailor who sort of came through and then left. Um, and his mother, who was of mixed race background, raised him as best she could with limited resources, and then she died when he was in his early teens. So at age 14, he's an orphan living on a pretty small out of the way island, part of the British Empire, but a little backwater island basically. Um, his racial background is mixed. His naturalization is mixed. He's not a likely person to become a man of prominence or means, except for one thing. He's absolutely brilliant. At age 14, he went to work for a local merchant and so impressed the merchant that within just a few weeks, the merchant left Alexander Hamilton in charge of the business while the merchant began to travel around to some of the other nearby islands to make business deals. And so imagine yourself at age 14 and being left in charge of a whole business. I can tell you when I was 14, my parents weren't sure that I should be in charge of vacuuming the house. But anyway, Hamilton has an incredible sharpness and shrewdness. He's got a brilliant mind, and anyone who ever met him immediately realized that. Well, he's still on a little island in the West Indies where he's not likely to come to fame or fortune, although certainly he's going to be well known in that part of the world. But then a terrible disaster struck because a huge hurricane swept through, leaving tremendous devastation over much of the Caribbean. And then, as now, people are fascinated by weather. Personally, I've never understood it. I don't really understand why we watch CNN and watch these. I don't know what the purpose of this is, but the guy standing there with the umbrella is like, "Whoa, it's really windy. Oh my gosh, the rain's coming down." I don't really get it myself, but there is apparently an odd fascination with bad weather and the devastation that it brings. Well, nobody has CNN or the Weather Channel in the 1760s because, that hasn't been invented and won't be for hundreds of years, but people really wanted to know what happened. So the only thing they can do is they can read the newspaper, but of course the newspaper doesn't know either. A newspaper in, say, New York or Philadelphia, they don't know what's going on in the Caribbean until somebody tells them about it, which means that the way newspapers found out about stuff that's going on around the world, someone who they knew had to write them a letter. And we still use this term today, a correspondent. To correspond means to write a letter. A correspondent is someone who gives information to the news from some other place, not where the news is actually written or filmed or whatever. So if you watch TV, if you're watching, everyone's watching a lot of news, and you watch something that's happening, say, in China or Italy or whatever, and if someone's reporting locally from there on CNN or MSNBC or God help you, Fox News, if you're watching that, you're watching foreign correspondents who are telling the viewer what's happening in another part of the world. Okay, well, people wanted to know what was going on with this terrible devastation. And young Alexander Hamilton wrote a letter to a newspaper in New York that he was aware was interested in information. That newspaper was so impressed that they then made it available for other newspapers to republish. This is the way news gets spread. Somebody publishes the news, and then another newspaper copies it, and another newspaper copies it, and it's a slow process. But eventually, people up and down the coast read this article, this letter, basically, that described the terrible devastation on his island and then what he had been able to determine about what had happened in some of the neighboring islands. And then people in New York found out that this incredibly impressive piece of writing was done by a guy who was a teenager. And so a group of wealthy bankers decided that they really didn't think that a young man of his talents should be wasting away in this small little island in this tiny little backwater part of the British Empire. And so they paid his way to come to New York, came to New York, and then they paid for him to enroll in what is now Columbia University, had just recently opened up as what was called King's College. And then he began to work his way up education and started to make a name for himself financially, economically, becomes a lawyer. And then around the same time that he arrived, the conflict between the British and the colonists is heating up. He was very strongly on the side of the Patriots. And so when the war actually began, he volunteered to help out the Continental Army. And because of his intellectual abilities, he quickly became an important aide to George Washington, the head of the Continental Army. They had sort of a surrogate father son relationship. Hamilton, of course, never knew his own father. Washington never had any sons. He blamed his wife for that, even though genetically it turns out that's his fault, not hers. But anyway, and it bothered him he had no sons. So throughout his life, he had at one time or another young men who he sort of looked upon as almost like his sons. And Hamilton is a good example of that. So Hamilton was right by his side during a lot of the key moments of the war. Then, after the war was over, went back to New York, became an important lawyer, became a banker, became a journalist, started the newspaper that still publishes the New York Post, started a bank that is still a big bank in New York and, in fact, all over the country, and had a tremendous amount of success there. And then got into local politics. I mentioned that he had supported the Constitution. He'd actually been at the Constitutional Convention, helped draft it, shaped it. A lot of the things he suggested didn't actually happen. He was thinking about something slightly different from what Madison came up with, but still, after it was all over, he supported the Constitution and was one of the anonymous writers of the Federalist Papers, which helped persuade at least a few people that the Constitution was a good idea and also gives us some information about what those guys were thinking. So he has supported the Constitution, he has supported George Washington, and Washington, right after he was elected president, tapped this young, intellectual, brilliant young mind as Secretary of the Treasury, and therefore as really the most important guy in the country with regards to the economy. And in fact, today, still, the Secretary of the Treasury is one of the most important people in the United States. I won't ask you if you know who the Secretary of the Treasury is, but you should. The same way you should not just know who the President and the Vice President and the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Everybody, if you live in this country, should know who are the people who are making the decisions that affect us. Secretary of the Treasury is one. Top 10 most important people in the country, probably. So, Secretary of the Treasury, the first one, Alexander Hamilton, sets important precedents the same way his boss did. Hamilton is young. He's only 34 years old, which, trust me, is young. He's been put in a very important position. He is brilliant, but he's also vain. He's pretty sure he's God's gift to women. He's going to be named as the other man in at least one divorce suit, meaning that he was doing things with the other man's wife. And he is pretty sure he's the most handsome man in the world, pretty sure he's the smartest guy in the world. He's arrogant beyond belief, makes enemies at the drop of a hat, and somewhat after his time as Secretary of the Treasury, is going to rub a former friend the wrong way so much that that guy eventually has a duel with him and kills him. But that's a little bit later. In the meantime, here's Alexander Hamilton in Washington's cabinet as one of the two or three most important people in this new country trying to help them get started. They've got important things to do. They've got to try to create an economically healthy country. They've got to come out from under the shadow of the British. And they've got to resolve leftover problems that the Articles of Confederation had not been able to solve about getting their economy started and dealing with the debt that was left over from the Revolutionary War. And Hamilton is very concerned because he, like many others in the leadership of the new country, were pretty sure that there was going to be some other kind of conflict between the U.S. and the major European countries. The U.S. is a republic. It's got a lot of territory. It's got a lot of resources, but it's a sort of a weak form of government. And the assumption was that some European power at some point would show up and try to take over, whether that be the British again, or the French would turn on them, or the Spanish, or somebody is going to try to get a little handsy with the United States and the U.S. needed to be able to defend itself. If they had to do it again, they wouldn't necessarily get lucky enough to get help from the outside, especially if they haven't figured out a way to pay off their debts from the first time. Hamilton is very worried also that because the U.S. always buys stuff from the British and had ever since the colonial days, they got to figure out a way to not have to do that anymore. He's got a very mercantilist view of the world and feels that if that's the way you understand the world, then the U.S. is starting out way, way where it should not be. So, these are his concerns, and he's trying to find moments to shape American policy to make the U.S. stronger and more independent and to give it the chance to be healthier as time goes on. An opportunity arrived to begin to address some of these problems when Congress requested a report from him in 1790. They want to know how much money they owe. They know that they owe still a lot of money left over from the American Revolution, and they just want to get an idea of how bad the problem is. So as Secretary of the Treasury, he's got access to that information, and so they requested information on that. He responded with what's called the Report on the Public Credit. Public credit in this case is national debt, in which he responded to their question, but then went way farther than they had originally intended. So in his report, Hamilton answered their question. If you guys want to know how much we owe, the national government, the federal government, the government that is the heir to the Continental Congress, that government owes a little more than $50 million, about $54 million in those days, which is a lot of money. It's been a lot of inflation, and so it turns out that's real money and real. But even $54 million, I don't have that kind of money lying around, and certainly the new Congress didn't have that kind of money lying around either. Now they hadn't asked him, but Hamilton figured that it was valuable information for Congress to know how much the states owed. Because during the Revolution, different states, colonies transitioning to states during the Revolution, had also had to borrow money to pay for the soldiers and various other things, and they still were working their way out of that debt. Trying to pay off that debt was what led to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, for example. So they hadn't asked him, but he figures they should know, and so he also says, and by the way, the sum total of all the state debts is a little bit less than half of what the national government, the federal government owes, like $24 million. So he put it all together, and his point is the U.S. owes a lot of money. Now, the rest of the report, Hamilton proposes a series of steps to address that debt. And there's multiple steps that he proposes, then become the big lightning rod issue in Congress for most of the rest of 1790 as they try to decide whether they want to take the steps that he's proposing. So first of all, Hamilton says, okay, we got the national debt, we got the state debt. I think that the first thing we should do is the federal government, the central government here, we should take the responsibility upon us to pay down the state debts also. Now, a lot of the states have been trying to do that on their own, and some of the states had even actually managed to pay all or most of their debt. So those states aren't going to be that thrilled that they're now, as part of the whole country, going to have to help pay off the debts of some of the states that hadn't been doing such a good job. But Hamilton's theory is the U.S. needs to make sure that it starts off looking pretty solid toward the rest of the world. And if the U.S. can't deal with some internal debts, so suppose the national government pays off its debts, and 11 out of the 13 original colonies pay off their debts, but 2 of them don't, then still the reputation that the U.S. will have is that the U.S. is a welsher on their debts, that the U.S. is economically weak. So as far as Hamilton is concerned, the most important thing here is that the federal government should take on the responsibility for the state debts, put it all together in one place, and then let's figure out what to do about that. Okay, so that's his first suggestion. Then he says, once we've decided to do that, once we move forward, then we need to look at who the debt is owed to. Because various people had loaned money directly to the states, directly to the Continental Congress, in some way helped supported the American Revolution, and it was a long and expensive war. Some of those people were here in the United States, and some of those people were from other countries. Hamilton says it's important for us to pay off the foreign debt first. They don't owe as much money to the foreigners, which is one reason why you might think that they're going to go for that first. But Hamilton is also thinking about reputation. If there is another war, the U.S. is going to need to be able to borrow money, not just locally, but also from overseas. If France fights us, then we need to borrow money from their enemies, the British. And if the British fight us, then we need to borrow money from their enemies, the French, or whoever, however it works out. But if the U.S. has not managed to pay off people from that country from the last war, then why would anybody loan us money in the next war? So paying off the foreign debt is, from the way Hamilton sees it, should be the top priority in dealing with all the debt that they have left over from the war. And his plan to do that is the U.S. government controls that territory west of the mountains, future states of Ohio and Indiana, places like that. Hamilton says we should begin to sell off some of that land to speculators and use that money as a way to pay off the foreign debt. Now, the problem is that there's not enough land and they can't make enough money to sell to earn enough to pay off all the domestic debt, the money that's owed to Americans, because that's most of the money. So, yes, we're going to assume the state debts, and yes, we're going to pay off the foreign debt, but what about all the money that's owed to Americans? And there's a lot of money that's owed to Americans. A lot of them have started to give up on ever seeing this money again, and there's a lot of grumpy feelings about the government in the early days here. Under the Articles, they've done a terrible job of redressing this, and now all eyes turn to that. And Hamilton, in the last part of his report on the public credit, came up with the most controversial of his suggestions, which was that the U.S. government should never try to pay that money back. It just was too much money. There's no way that they could come up with that kind of cash. It's millions and millions of dollars at a time when the government is very small and has very limited resources to raise money to find a way to pay off that kind of debt. Instead, what Hamilton proposes is let's rethink that debt. Yes, people loan the government money, but now let's think of it as investment. Let's turn those debts, those IOUs, let's turn them into like a bond. When you buy a bond, you give the government money, and the government holds on to that money and uses it for whatever it uses it for, but they promise that at a certain time they're going to give some money as interest to the person who owns the bond. And so it's going to be a similar thing that Hamilton is proposing. Suppose the government owes me $100. Hamilton is proposing that we promise that person an interest rate that would be pretty fair, higher than they could get in a bank. So if the banks can give you 2 or 3%, then he's going to promise 4 or 5%, something like that. So if it's thought of as an investment, but has a good return on the investment, then people may not be so angry that they're not getting all their money back. If they live long enough, they'll get the whole thing back. But in the meantime, the government just has to come up with a small percentage of it every year and give that to the people who have these IOU papers left over from the Revolution. And that will be raised through customs duties. There's stuff coming in and out of the ports, and it's traditional that there's government money that happens from what's going on in those business transactions there. They can raise that kind of money and get the interest rate that they'll use to pay a percentage of the domestic debt to the holders of that debt. What Hamilton is thinking here is not only can we not afford to pay off all that debt, but also if we keep rich people in the country who loaned us money in the first place, or the rich people who bought the IOU papers from them, if we keep them on the hook, if we keep them invested in the country, if we keep them thinking that they need the country to survive, the government to continue to exist, for them to keep getting some money, then the next time we need to borrow money, it'll be easier to ask them, because they will have an incentive in the continuing existence of the United States government. As opposed to if magically Hamilton can pay back all the domestic debt, all those people with a lot of money would invest it probably overseas. The strongest bank in the world at this point is in London. And so, if you're a smart investor, you would put your money over there or in London businesses, English businesses. But the last thing in the world Hamilton wants is all the rich people in this country investing in stocks, bonds, or whatever, or putting their money in businesses or banks over in England, because what if the U.S. fights England? What if the next war, which he's convinced is going to happen, what if the next war is against England again? If all the rich people in the country have all their money invested in England, well, then they're going to kind of want England to win, and they're not really going to want the Americans to win. So he's trying to enforce patriotism. He's trying to economically leverage the sentiments of the wealthiest people in the country, the ones to whom the government owes money, by forcing them to have an incentive in the continuing existence of the government so that then later on we can get money from them if we need it. It's sort of a sneaky way to create patriotism and gives you some idea of the way his mind works. Now Congress has to talk about it. And there was a lot of controversy about what he's proposing. A bill was proposed in Congress by some of Hamilton's supporters to do those various stages for the public debt that he had proposed, but it wasn't clear that it was going to pass through Congress. Hamilton is as shrewd a political operator as anybody in this time, and he can count votes as well as anyone, and he's not sure it's going to pass. So he needs to twist a few arms and get some people to go along with the ideas in the report on the public credit and support the bill that's going to make those things happen. But he has another piece of leverage, which is that the government is doing other things at the same time. They've got a lot of stuff going on. One of which is they have to decide where is the national capital going to wind up. At the moment, it was in New York, but everyone knew that was temporary. And take a moment to think about the idea if New York City had stayed the capital of the country. Forget about all the terrible trauma going on there because of the coronavirus, where it is a hotspot, and that's horrible. But just think about that incredibly complex, densely populated, but also economically crucial city, also being the political capital of the country. That's a mind-boggling concept, but it could have happened. But it's pretty clear that New York is really not where it's going to stay, and instead, everybody wants the capital to move to their part of the country, which is ironic now because a lot of people outside of Washington say mean things about Washington, i.e., Washington, D.C. They like George Washington. But at the time, there was almost a rivalry going on between the different parts of the country to have the capital in their part of the country. And a committee is going to be set up that's going to make the final determination about where they're going to put the capital. And as it turns out, Hamilton has a lot to say about who's on that committee, which means Hamilton has a lot to say about where the capital is going to wind up, which means that since Hamilton can influence that, Hamilton has some leverage that he can trade, and he went to shop that leverage. So it turns out that there are some people who weren't sure where they thought about the report on the public credit from the D.C. area of today, in other words, from Virginia and Maryland. And these Maryland and Virginians, they're hoping that the capital can get put on the banks of the Potomac, and each of them will get a little bit of a share, and thus bring a lot of credit and interest in their region. That's what they're hoping for. Well, Hamilton went to these folks and said, listen, if you support the bill that's going to enact the report on the public credit, I will make sure to use my influence with the committee that's going to locate the new capital to make sure that it is on the banks of the Potomac, partly in Virginia, partly in Maryland, and therefore your region of the country will be the big winners in this rivalry. But more to the point, if you know this now, then you can buy land along the coast of the Potomac on either the Virginia or the Maryland side. And then when the government locates the capital there, they're going to have to buy that land from you and you can make a nice profit. Today, this would be illegal. Today, this would be insider trading. Today, this would be the sort of thing that would get anybody in a lot of trouble. In fact, it's probably even worse than some of the stuff that some of these senators got caught doing in the last month or so. It's pretty bad. But the rules are very lax in those days. And Hamilton was able to, with this influence, twist enough arms that Congress did enact the bill that was going to support the ideas of the report on the public credit. And so those different stages of the debt did become the way that the government responded to it. And therefore, they're going to start with debt, but use the debt in a way differently than previously had been sort of sitting there causing a problem. And lo and behold, when the committee did decide where they're going to put the capital, it wound up right in our neighborhood, just a little ways south of where I'm sitting, on the banks of the Potomac, partly in Maryland, partly in Virginia. The Virginia part of it eventually got handed back to Virginia. Long, long story. But the Maryland side of it still is the District of Columbia and is whatever it is. Someday a future state, maybe, but for right now, a city, a capital, and a feather in the cap for Alexander Hamilton, who used some shrewd wheeling dealing to get what he wanted. Again, gives you some idea of the kind of guy that he is. Now, later in 1790, flushed off that success, Hamilton sent Congress another report called the Report on a National Bank. Banks are very, very important to the economy. And I don't mean that because that's where the ATMs are. ATMs, of course, come much later. Banks are important because they promote entrepreneurship. People who have money in banks are putting it there because they think that the bank is going to figure out a way not just to hold on to it, but to get them an interest rate, to earn more money, which means that bankers are business people. Bankers' jobs, the main job of a banker is to find a way to invest that money that will then earn a profit. And so what happens to a bank's money is it doesn't just sit there in the vault, but instead it gets loaned out into the community in ways that hopefully will stimulate the economy. And if somebody, an entrepreneur, has an idea, whether it's to start a new company, start a restaurant, to open a hotel, to expand something that already exists or whatever, they need capital to do that. They need money. And if they don't have that money lying around, which for most big projects they don't, they have to go to a bank and borrow it, which requires them to show up with a plan to show that here's my plan, I know what I'm doing, here's why you can trust me, here's what I think I'm going to earn in the long run. And if that plan makes sense, and if it seems like it's got some kind of a good money making idea to it, then the bankers will loan that person that money, and then they'll have the money to expand or start something new or whatever. But the point is that can only happen if banks are successful, if banks exist, if banks are trustworthy. Banks are important to stimulate that kind of entrepreneurship because at the local level, they help grease the wheels of keeping capital flowing and keeping new ideas actually being developed and put out. So the problem is if the banks are terrible, if nobody can trust the banks, or if the banks make bad decisions, then that role is going to be disastrously played. And the entrepreneurs in any community aren't going to be sure if they can get any money. And more importantly, the people with cash aren't going to be sure they could put their money in a bank. Banks in the early days of the Republic, really anybody could start a bank. All you needed to do was just get somebody who knew you in the state government or sometimes even the local government, and they would just give you the rights to start a bank. I could have started a bank, and trust me, I should not be starting a bank. But the first bank of Mark Santangelo could have been, I could have just put a sign outside my house and said, hey, I'm a bank, come invest your money with me. And it was almost that easy, and it was almost that ridiculous, and they're almost that bad. Banks failed all the time in the early days of the Republic because a lot of the people who start them, they don't really have good economic background. They make a lot of bad investments. They make terrible mistakes. And the problem is that if you put your money in a bank that fails, then you lose all your money. Today, the government insures the deposits. And if you go to a bank that doesn't have one of those FDIC signs in front of it, you should not be putting your money there because the government is not insuring your money. But you can trust your money in pretty much every bank in the country because if something terrible happens and the bankers, it doesn't work out, then the government will make sure you, the investor, gets your money back at least. And so therefore you can put your money there. But why would you put your money, if you have any extra cash, in one of the banks that existed in the 1790s? It'd be foolish. Unless you really know the banker, unless you're good friends with him, unless you trust, you have reason to trust that banker and you know that they know what they're doing, which is going to limit the kind of money that any banker is going to be able to have access to, which means they won't have much to loan, which means that they will not be able to stimulate entrepreneurship, which means that there'll be a lot of money that could circulate through the local economy that instead is going to be buried in somebody's backyard or in some other way kind of frozen without being of use to the greater community. Well, banks also serve another purpose. Today we have paper currency, and that has existed since the 19 teens. But in the early days of the United States government, the only currency that the government actually issued, was coins, which are not a particularly flexible or useful way to do anything beyond small transactions. So some kind of flexible currency, some flexible means of exchange needs to exist for more complicated or for larger transactions, but the federal government isn't in the business of doing that. Instead, that is also the job of the banks. Banks hold on to the money in the vaults, they make investments to local entrepreneurs, and then they also issue paper notes. A bank note is what it's called. And that is basically a promise, a promissory note. They issue pieces of paper saying this piece of paper is worth $10 from the Bank of Mark Santangelo. And you can go get the actual 10 real dollars, the hard currency that might be back in the bank vault, anytime you need it. But in the meantime, that piece of paper is very flexible because it can move around through the local economy. If I know it's really worth $10, then I can get $10 of hardware or $10 of cattle or $10 of whatever. And then that person can take that $10 banknote and use it to buy $10 worth of something else or whatever. So banknotes, the paper currency that the banks issue, are crucial to any kind of economic viability, except for the fact that the banks are terrible. And the banks are terrible. And a piece of paper issued by the first bank of Mark Santangelo that says it's worth $10 is really only going to be worth what the person who's getting that piece of paper thinks it's really worth. So it says $10 on it, but if somebody's actually met me, they're like, well, that guy doesn't have any money. You say this is worth $10, I'll give you $3. I'll give you $3 worth of nails for this. And the person holding the piece of paper is like, well, I was told it was worth $10. And the person's, well, you take it or leave it. And so all the paper currency is all really based on just what the reputation is. The farther away you go from where the bank issued it, the less likely anyone's going to take it, or that they're certainly going to discount it considerably. And this is really no way to run an economy where every economic transaction is based on a negotiation. $10 should be $10 should be $10. That's the way it should work. But the banks are so terrible and so weak that their banknotes really they don't make it happen. So what Hamilton is proposing is that all those local banks can continue to exist, and they may serve useful purpose in the local areas or whatever. But there needs to be some sort of a bank that can help kind of organize the whole banking system. And he's proposing that Congress make it happen. So in his report on the National Bank, he proposes that Congress give the rights to the creation of a Bank of the United States. And it will be henceforth known as its initials, BUS, the Bank of the United States, the BUS. That's what everybody calls it. It's not a government institution. It's not going to be run by the government. It'll be run by private bankers. They'll just be given the rights to set it up, and they can have branches of it in different parts of the country. But the government will have a vote on the board of directors, and most importantly, the Bank of the United States will be required to be the place that the government keeps its money until it needs it. So the government has ways to raise money, whether it's the sale of Western lands or customs duties or other smaller things. And so money will be coming in and out of the government coffers all the time. Rather than the government sort of holding on to it themselves, the government is now going to promise that they're going to deposit it in the Bank of the United States, which means that the Bank of the United States not only will be one of the biggest banks in the country, but it'll also be a safe bank. Because the government makes money all the time. There will be regular deposits in that bank, which means the Bank of the United States is never going to go bankrupt. The Bank of the United States is always going to be safe, which means that other people who are looking for a place to put their money will know they can put their money in the Bank of the United States. And therefore, that bank will have cash to make investments, to invest in local entrepreneurs in the places where the different branches will be, New York and Philadelphia, but also down in the South. Baltimore has a branch. There's one in Charleston, and there are other smaller local branches. And so people know that they can put their money in the local branch of the Bank of the United States because it's not going to go bankrupt. The person who runs it is not going to disappear one day with a sign that says, "Sorry, folks, bank's closed. Come back next year." They don't have to worry about that. So it's going to have money to stimulate entrepreneurship, to invest in the local economies, to help expand the local economies. The bank is going to be serving that important purpose. And it's banknotes. Again, it's not a government institution, they're a private company. But its banknotes can be trusted all over the country because everyone will know it's based on real money, it's based on a real institution that is viable, and if you get far away from the part of the bank that issued it, you can go to some other local branch and still cash it in for real money if you need to. So a banknote issued by the Bank of the United States in Trenton, New Jersey will still be worth $10 if you go to Providence, Rhode Island, because the same bank is still just as trustworthy there, which means that you can have an actual economy with a currency that flows back and forth where people can sort of trust and know what it is. So, Hamilton proposes this Bank of the United States, and he sends this report to Congress in 1790. In those days, in the early days of the country, Congress only met a few months out of the year. The idea, I guess, was that they didn't really have that much to do. And so, although he sent them the report in 1790, they didn't pick it up again until 1791 when they came back. In the meantime, he had sent them a third report. And so I won't tell you what happened with the bank because there's a debate about the bank and the third report that sort of get intertwined. We'll come back to that. So Hamilton's third report, which he wrote up in 1791 and sent to Congress in 1791, and then they discussed and considered in 1791, then when they came back into office, is called the Report on Manufacturers. A manufacturer is a thing that's made in a factory or a manufactory, as it used to be called. In other words, it is a product. It is something that doesn't just grow, but that can be sold, bought, and sold, and so forth. So, Hamilton was very concerned that the U.S., as it's struggling to become an independent economy, was basically forced to buy things from the British because the British has a healthier economy and the British, at this point, had begun the early stages of industrialization and were the best in the world at making things that everyone, especially here in America, wants to buy. Not only did they make a lot of it, they also made it cheap. And so Hamilton is worried about that, though, because if the U.S. buys all its stuff from the British, then what if the British ever attack us, or for some reason we've got a conflict with the British? If we buy everything from them, then they kind of have us over a barrel. As I said, he thinks of the world very much in a mercantilist sort of a way. So, Hamilton wants to figure out a way to encourage domestic manufacturing. And there are businesses that are slowly getting started, mostly up in New England and places, and New York and New Jersey. There aren't really that many of them in the southern states because southern investors aren't interested in starting up factories or new businesses. They'd rather have big plantations. If they have any extra money, they buy more land or they buy more slaves. But up in New York and New England, there are early examples of some of these small scale production facilities, very small scale. They're just getting started. The problem is they're so small scale and they're so getting started, they're not very good at what they're doing. Hamilton would like them to get pretty good at it to the point where they can be competitive, but in the meantime, you kind of have to be dumb to buy an American made product when you can get a better quality and cheaper British made product. In fact, that was the story that was available in most of the stores. If you go to your local general store, if you have an option to buy an American made, say, pair of shoes or a British made pair of shoes, the British pair of shoes, they're better quality and they also are cheaper. And so, although you may be as patriotic as can be and you want to buy USA and support American industry, but on the other hand, if you spend money buying the American stuff, then you have to spend more money. And you're kind of an idiot because it's not even good quality. it's just going to fall apart, and you're just going to have to come back later and buy some other shoes. You may as well get the cheaper but better quality British shoes or whatever the other product is. That's the smart decision to make, especially since most Americans in the early days of the country are farmers, which means they never have any money. Farmers make money once a year. They sell their product, whatever it is. When the harvest comes in, they harvest it and then they sell it on the open market and make whatever kind of money they can make. They don't really control the price very much. They hope that they can then pay off all their debts that they've accrued since the last year when they sold off whatever they sold last year. And then with whatever money left over, then they hope that they can last as far as they can before they start borrowing money again. That's the life of a farmer, which means that farmers, which is probably 80% of the population at least, farmers don't have any cash most of the time. And since they're doing most of the buying, they're really not that likely to be wasting money on patriotism. But Hamilton is concerned because if Americans don't buy American made products, then those businesses up in New England, New York, and New Jersey, they're not going to last. And eventually, there'll be no American manufacturers because they're all going to go out of business because they're going to have no customers. And then the British will be the only way we can get these things. And then the British can charge whatever they want. And also, they will really control the American economy and kind of tell us what to do. Those are Hamilton's concerns. Again, he's a mercantilist. He is worried about being as economically independent as possible. But how can the U.S. government encourage that? How can the U.S. government encourage American manufacturing, and how can the American government encourage regular everyday Americans buying stuff from the American manufacturers? Well, what Hamilton proposes in the Report on Manufacturers, which he issued in 1791, is what's called a tariff. Hamilton did not invent the idea of a tariff. It had been around for a very long time. He's just suggesting a particular example of a tariff, a particularly high tariff, among other things. A tariff is a tax on imports. The government is going to receive money from whoever brings that thing in. That money is going to go to the government, and then, of course, whoever brought it in from overseas is then going to add that extra cost to the overall price before they sell it to the consumer. So, what Hamilton is proposing is that the U.S. government, for each of the major goods that the U.S. buys from the British that come in as imports on the ships that are coming across the Atlantic into all the big port cities, he is proposing that the government add a high tariff to all of those items, which will therefore raise the price of the British goods above what the price would be of the American made goods, which don't have this tariff added on to it. So if, for example, you could previously buy a $3 pair of British shoes or a $5 pair of American shoes, and no way would you be foolish enough to buy the American pair of shoes, what Hamilton is proposing is let's add a $3 tariff to those British shoes. The person who's bringing that in, the person who's buying those British shoes when they get off the boat, will pay that tariff to the government, and then that person will turn around, add that to the final cost of the British shoes, which means that when they go on sale, they'll cost $6. And therefore, when you go to the store, your choice is a $6 pair of American shoes or a $5 pair of a $6 pair of British shoes or a $5 pair of American shoes, and then sure you'll buy the American shoes because they're cheaper. What he is hoping is that if Congress agrees to add such a high tariff, it will make American manufacturers more competitive against the British, and he's hoping that that will sort of stir things up enough that they will begin to figure out how to do the things the British were doing and to make a better quality product for a cheaper rate eventually, and that these tariffs wouldn't have to stay so high if the Americans could figure out a way to lower the price of the product. But in the short run, this will encourage consumers to buy American-made goods. Now, Hamilton had sent the previous report, the report of the National Bank, in 1790, and sent this one in 1791. But as I said, Congress was out of session when he sent that other one. And so when they came back, they basically had both of these reports to look at, and suddenly there's a tremendous uproar as they look at what he is proposing, because a bunch of people were very much angry with what Hamilton was suggesting. People like Jefferson and Madison and other allies, especially from southern states and western states where there aren't a lot of banks, where there aren't a lot of manufactured goods, where mostly people are farmers, they're very angry at what they saw in these two proposals. Opponents of the bank were very concerned that what he was suggesting was a behemoth, a powerful economic institution that would have way too much control over the economy and would lead to corruption. They were convinced that this kind of economic entity would be terrible for the country, dangerous for the country, and therefore they opposed it very strongly. The same group of people, Jefferson, Madison, and many people from southern and western states, were very opposed to the report on manufacturers. It's not going to help them any if the business people up in New England, New York, and New Jersey suddenly have the government helping them stay in business. It's not going to help the southern economy. And in fact, since most of the southern and western people are farmers, they're really going to be hurt as a result of this because they have very little cash. And now all of a sudden they're being forced to spend more money for products that previously were cheaper. In my example there with the shoes, you used to be able to buy $3 British shoes. Now you have to buy either $6 British shoes or $5 American shoes, and you have to buy shoes at some point. You're going to have to spend more money. And so the representatives, people like Jefferson and Madison, and people who represent the more farming regions of the country were very upset at what they saw in the report of manufacturers. Why should we be helping out business people who don't seem very good at their jobs? And why should we be artificially raising the price? That's going to hurt the common man. That's going to hurt the regular everyday person. Then there is a concern that was raised by Jefferson and Madison and their supporters against both the bank and the report on manufacturers, which is that they said these two ideas that he's proposing were unconstitutional. Now, I'm going to say if James Madison, who basically wrote the Constitution, says that something is unconstitutional, we should probably pay attention. Jefferson and Madison and the opponents of the bank and the tariff said, well, if you look at the Constitution, nowhere in the Constitution does it give Congress the right to create a national bank or to raise a high tariff for the purpose of defending against cheap imports. And since it doesn't say Congress can do it, Congress can't do it. Jefferson and Madison are taking what's called a strict construction or a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They're trying to limit the powers of the central government to make sure that it doesn't run around and do crazy things, that it won't eventually get so strong that it will take away the rights of the people. But they're very much limiting what the government could do. Hamilton and his supporters, most of whom are from New England and some of the mid-Atlantic states, said, well, if you look at the Constitution, and you should know because, Madison, you pretty much wrote it, it doesn't say the government can't do these things. And there's some flexibility in some of the language of the Constitution that implies that the government can do other things for other purposes as long as they're not expressly forbidden. And so the supporters of Hamilton and folks like him are taking what's called a loose construction or a loose interpretation of the Constitution. If it's not forbidden, then we should be allowed to do it. And the big question here, and it continues to this day, how much are we allowed to interpret the Constitution? How much can we read into the ideas in the Constitution? Clearly, some amount of interpretation is important because otherwise a document written in 1787 would have a very tough time managing a government for a country that is very different, much bigger, more complex, with many kinds of problems that they never even imagined in 1787. Some interpretation is necessary, but how much? And that's still the question that we're asking today. Okay, as it turns out, in the debates that followed, Jefferson and Madison were not able to block the report on the national bank. The Bank of the United States was created with a federal charter set up the way Hamilton had proposed, with branches in different parts of the country where it will raise money. The federal government will have to put all its money there so people will trust it, and its banknotes will therefore be trustworthy. But their concerns did lead to one small change Madison or Hamilton wanted this to be a bank that would exist forever, just a business that would work until it ran out of money, in the same way any other business goes. But the charter that created the Bank of the United States when it passed in 1791 was limited to 20 years. So if Madison and Jefferson were right and the Bank of the United States was just too dangerous, well, then what they've done is they've limited the danger. They've limited its possible effects because in 1811 it'll just go out of business. So Hamilton accepted this as the best he could do and got it through. The report of manufacturers, he had to accept even more of a compromise. Congress is not willing to vote in tariffs at that extremely high rate that he had proposed. But they are willing to vote in some tariffs that will make U.S. industry a little bit more competitive against British manufacturing. So they don't get the high tariffs that are going to make all American goods cheaper than all British goods, but they do get some tariffs that are going to be added to the price of the British goods to make the numbers a little bit closer. And this, like the report of the National Bank, doesn't just sort of end there because this begins a long series of discussions of the tariff. I got to say, tariff policy, which is a huge part of early American history, I personally find very boring. Sorry, don't tell anybody I said that. But what starts to happen from 1791 and continuing all the way through at least the next 100 years, and it still comes up in the modern context today as the U.S. tries to figure out its relationship with its trading partners. The tariff is a recurring issue. Every few years, Congress, in the years following the 1791 first big tariff, Congress addresses how they were doing. So, do we need to raise the tariff on shoes or lower it? Do we need to raise the tariff on sugar or lower it? Do we need to raise the tariff on computers or tinker toys? You pick whatever it is. And ultimately, today, the tariff bill, which is reproposed and re-argued and then repassed every few years, is this incredibly complex, thousands of pages long, as the tariff rate on all kinds of different items has to be negotiated and it either goes up or down. And many people in other parts of the world and here have a lot riding on what those tariff rates are going to be. Personally, I find it to be a very difficult and kind of dry part of economics and politics, but it mattered a lot. It matters a lot to who's going to succeed in early American business, and it's going to matter a lot to how the U.S. interacts with these other countries. So Hamilton got all of what he wanted from the first report, most of what he wanted from the second report, and some of what he wanted from the third report, although he wasn't satisfied. But in the process, Hamilton's reports and the argument over them helped create the first true national divisions in the new country. It took a little while, but certainly by Washington's second term, there are two philosophies of government that see each other as opposed to each other. People who support Hamilton are referred to as the Federalists. Federalists are thinking that the government should get involved actively in the government in the economy, and therefore are thinking of a stronger federal government, which is why they call themselves the Federalists. They are Hamilton, John Adams, maybe George Washington, although he tries to stay out of it, most of Washington's cabinet, and then most elected officials from the more manufacturing-based northern states that are based on manufacturing and trade. So the New England states, New York and New Jersey, are where you're more likely to see the Federalists. The opponents they go by a bunch of different names. I'm going to go with Democratic Republicans, although they're frequently just called the Republicans, and it's worth pointing out that's not the same Republicans as today. We'll get to them later. This is an early political group, not the same group. The Democratic Republicans are Jefferson and Madison and people who support them, mostly from the southern or more western states, the more farm and agriculture-based states. What's going on here is not the creation of political parties. Political parties are organizations that are defined, that have a charter, that raise money. There's all kinds of ways that these are not political parties. Instead, they're philosophies. There are two groups of people who look at each other and say, we're right and you're wrong. And they're what's referred to as factions. So this first political division isn't the creation of two political parties, although your textbook sometimes uses that word, which it shouldn't. Instead, they're the first two major factions in the country. But in some ways, from our point of view, that difference may not really matter. I can tell you that the faction of Hamilton, the Federalists, and it's worth pointing out, it's not the same Federalists as the last lecture. The Federalists in 1788 were people who supported the Constitution, and their opponents were the Anti-Federalists. In 1794, the Federalists are people who like Hamilton. And I can tell you that that's confusing, but they're not the same people. Madison was a Federalist in 1788. Now Madison is one of the main opponents of the Federalists. Apparently, history is just designed to confuse you. Anyway, the Federalists of the 1790s are the faction that believe in a strong central government, the faction that believes that the government should get involved in the economy, so therefore the faction that focuses on what's good for manufacturers, what's good for bankers, what's good for business. They think that if the government focuses on that, then everyone else will succeed. They therefore think that things like a bank, tariffs, and so forth, that these are all what the government's job should be. Their opponents, Jefferson is the leader, Madison is sort of the co-leader, and then the other people in the Democratic Republicans, the opposing faction, they stand for basically all the opposite. They don't believe that the central government should be very strong. It bothers them. They're worried that if the central government gets too strong, it'll take away your rights and everyone else's rights. They instead want to focus on the states. They believe that in the federal system of power, the states should be more important because they're more answerable to the people and therefore less likely to take away the people's rights. They believe that the government should be focused not on the rich people, but on the regular people. As far as Jefferson was concerned, if republicanism was going to work, we need to make sure that we have a government that focuses on the majority of the republic, which are in those days the farmers, the common people, the regular average Joe Blow farmers who are doing most of the work of the country. All policies should be thought of through the lens of what's good for the common man. And any policy that doesn't help the common man, which basically means your average local neighborhood farmer, then that policy is not good for the country. So therefore, they oppose big national banks. They oppose high tariffs. And in general, they really oppose strongly Hamilton's ideas, which seem to them to be trying to take the economy and control it just for a handful of people. Now, these factions aren't necessarily a big deal because according to the ideas of the people who drafted the Constitution just a few years earlier, differences of opinion are going to happen. That's fine. Sometimes you're going to have some people on one side of an issue, sometimes you'll have people on the other side of the issue. According to Federalist number 10, the next time it'll be a different set of people on different sides of a different issue, and therefore they'll figure out a way to get along as they move forward. The problem is that's not what happened. These two factions, with their two differing ideas of politics and economics, they're two different answers to the key question, what should the government do and who should the government be for? Which, by the way, are still kind of the key questions that you should ask yourself about the government and its role in the country. These two factions dug in part because the next series of events also reinforce the same two divisions. Specifically, there's a foreign policy event that starts overseas and has a major effect here in the United States that the two factions found themselves on different sides of. In France, starting in 1789, the French Revolution, which I alluded to previously, began, which turned into eventually a full-scale revolt against the king, against the aristocrats, against the whole class system of the country, and led eventually to France declaring themselves a republic. Well, that should be good news for the United States because here the United States had been trying this experiment as a republic, had been trying to show the rest of the world that republicanism is a good thing, is the best thing, And now France, who had been their allies just a decade earlier, now France has decided that they like that idea too, and that they're going to try to go this republic route as well. That should have been great news for the Americans, except that the French went a little bit farther in the direction of a French revolution than the Americans had done in their social revolution. So the French don't just get rid of the king, they chop the king's head off. They don't just object to some of the class system, they start actually murdering some of the aristocrats, in some cases quite gruesomely in public displays of chopping their heads off. And the French don't just declare themselves a republic after a few years of slowly building chaos. When things really came to a head, not only did they declare themselves a republic, but then they declared war on every country in Europe that's not a republic. And since they're the first one, that means that they declared war on all the rest of Europe, basically. And in case you were wondering, that does, yes, it does mean that France and England will be fighting again. Because the English saw themselves as the strongest supporter of the old ways of a monarchy and of status quo, of some kind of economic order, and brought together as into an alliance as many other European countries as they could, who then went after the French, and the French and the English are fighting again, and it's another big war that took off in the 1790s. Well, the U.S. is watching all this happening, and at first, of course, are rooting pretty heavily for the French because, they were our friends during the last war, and now they're declaring themselves a republic. Yay, way to go. But Washington, as the president of the United States, is very worried about where the French are going with all this, and certainly once the French declared war on the British, is very worried about what this is going to mean for him, for the United States. The French are convinced that as soon as they declared war on all the other countries of Europe, that the Americans, of course, would help them because the Americans had been helped by the French. These two countries had been allies. And so here we're trying the same thing. You need to help us out too. Philosophically and historically, we have these important ties, and diplomats from France are trying to encourage Washington to recognize the French Republic and to join them in an alliance that will be against all the monarchies of Europe. Washington's a little worried, though, that they're going to lose, and so he's not so sure about this. Meanwhile, the British assumed that the Americans would help them because, well, it used to be us not that long ago, and the French are crazy. They represent a much more radical philosophy, even of republicanism, which seems silly to the British. Um, and because of economic ties and ties of history and culture, the British are 100% convinced that the Americans should help them. And they send diplomats over to the United States asking Washington to help them out. And Washington's like, I don't know, I just fought against you guys not that long ago. As it plays out in Washington's mind, he's not sure who's going to win. Doesn't look that good for the French. He's not sure he wants to put his money behind the British either. Instead, he wants to just stay out of it. And what Washington is hoping that the United States can do is just stay neutral. The great thing about being neutral when two sides are fighting is you can do business with both of them. If you pick a side, you've got to work just with that side. But if you're neutral, if you don't pick a side, you could do business with both. And so the beauty of neutrality, as Washington saw it, was that economically, the U.S. can continue to trade with the British, can continue to trade with the French, and go about its own way and let them fight it out. As far as Washington was concerned, the key thing here is that we didn't have to get dragged into this European war. They're fighting over there. We're way over here. We don't have to get dragged into that. That's their thing. And Washington made very clear to the country, it made very clear to these diplomats from these other two countries, we're not going to pick a side. We're going to stay neutral. We're going to stay out of your war. We're going to do business with both of you. God bless you both. We'll see how this all works out, but we're not picking a side. The French, furious. The British, unbelievable. How can you guys have the gall not to work with us? Both the British and the French responded to this neutrality by just ignoring it as much as they could. If French ships saw American ships on their way to the British, then those French ships would intercept the American ships and stop them from going to Britain. If they have to sink them, they'll do that. If they have to just sort of shoot at them for a while until the Americans turn around, they'll do that too. And the British do the same things. The British attack American ships that they think are on their way to France. They don't want anybody helping out their enemies, and this is illegal. You're not allowed to attack neutrals. You're not allowed to attack representatives of neutral countries. Uh, Washington and his entire diplomatic corps object as much as they can, but the United States is far too weak to be able to do anything about this attack on their neutrality. The British and the French are much stronger than the United States and are so irritated with the Americans for not picking sides. There's very little that Washington can do about it, which makes them very angry. To make matters even worse, when the French and the British see American ships in the high seas, they're also kidnapping American sailors. Again, this is not sort of the thing you're allowed to do. It does exist, but you have to have a good reason to do it. Both the British and the French, their reason is they're desperate for sailors. This is largely a naval war, and so they need ships and they need sailors. And so they just kidnap American sailors whenever they can to sort of point a gun at them and say, come, get off the American ship. You're working for us now. This is called impressment. Sailors traditionally get forced to work for whoever all the time, but this is a pretty extreme example of it, where British naval officers or French naval officers essentially kidnap American sailors and force them to work for them. Again, Washington and the United States government object and say, you guys can't keep kidnapping our sailors. And the response of the British and the French is pretty much, oh, yeah? Stop us. And there's very little that the Americans can do, which is incredibly frustrating. This big war is going on overseas. It's getting hotter and hotter. It lasts for a long time. And the Americans are trying to take advantage of their neutrality to do business with both. And instead, the two major powers are just wiping the floor with the Americans, kidnapping American sailors, destroying American ships, forcing American ships to not do business with their enemies, violating all kinds of international concepts of what the laws of the maritime world are supposed to be. But because the U.S. is so weak, there's almost nothing they can do about it, which is frustrating and creates a lot of anger. And the thing is that there are people in the United States who are rooting for the two different sides. Some people like the French. Some people wish the British would win. As it turns out, most of the people who like the French are Democratic Republicans, supporters of Jefferson and Madison. The French love Jefferson. They constantly quote the Declaration of Independence and some of Jefferson's other ideas. They're Republicans, and they emphasize a lot of the same ideas of republicanism that the Democratic Republicans, whose emphasis is on the common man, that they also represent. And most of the supporters of the Democratic Republicans are from southern and western states who don't do that much business with the British. So the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, they support the French in this big foreign policy thing. They want the Americans to pick that side. Whereas the Federalists, they support the British. The Federalists are mostly up in New England and New York. Most of their business deals are with the British, and so it's to their benefit for the British to do well in this. Also, conservative cultural values make them less likely to support a revolution of the kind of class-based level that the French are undergoing. A lot of the people in New England are horrified by what they see in France, especially once it gets to the Reign of Terror and the guillotine is out in the streets. Many of the New England Federalists are appalled, and they say, well, the Americans, we should support the British. This is the big issue of Washington's second term, and these two factions that already disagreed philosophically about domestic policy and disagreed philosophically about what the government should do. It turns out they also disagree about foreign policy, which then makes the divisions even harder, even sharper. And Washington sees in his second term, as these factions get more dug in against each other, as they start hurling insults against each other, as they start claiming that the other one is out to destroy the country, Washington watches this happen with dismay. As he gets to the end of his second term, he could have run for a third. There was nothing stopping him. Now, since the 1950s, an amendment to the Constitution was added that limits the presidential terms to 2 terms. That didn't exist back then. Washington could have run for a third term, could have kept on running until he died. But he didn't want to be in office till he died. He didn't want to be the leader of the country until, like a king, eventually someday he died and then they had to replace him. As far as he was concerned, 2 terms were enough. And in fact, he's going to die in 1799. His health is beginning to fail him. He wants to retire and enjoy at least some years of peace and quiet in the comfort of his own home and get to see his wife again for once. But nothing was stopping him from running for a third term other than his own sense that 2 terms was enough. By not running for a third term, he set a precedent that lasted, although unofficially, for a century and a half, until finally in the 1940s it was broken by Franklin Roosevelt, and he needed the terrible international crisis of World War II to give him the justification to run for a third term and actually win. So, create a new precedent by deciding not to run for a third term, and late in 1796 set one last precedent. He knows he's not going to be president anymore, but he wants to send a message to the country before he goes home. And so Washington worked up a farewell address to the country. It's actually written as a letter that is sent to Congress, Washington's farewell address, 1796, in which he goes over his achievements, and there were many, but then also offered some warnings that they should think about moving forward because the country, as he was seeing it, was really in serious trouble. Other presidents will write farewell addresses also. If a president gets to the end of a term and hasn't died in office, then they're going to try to shape the story of their administration by writing up a document about what they've done to try to sort of give a little hint to the history books. Here's what I accomplished. And all of those other presidential farewell addresses are worthless. They, with the exception of Eisenhower's, have no big ideas in any of them. They're mostly just a laundry list of here's what I did. And the here's what I did part of Washington's farewell address is not really all that exciting either. But the warnings, those are pretty important. Because Washington has 2 big warnings for the country, one of which shows his understanding of what's going on in the country, nothing he can do about it though, and the other one of which turns out to be vitally important to the U.S. for the next 100 years. So first warning is his warning about factions. Washington said in one part of the farewell address of 1796 that if the country continued to be broken down into these 2 factions that argued with each other and hated each other so much that we would inevitably be so divided that we would never be able to really truly unite again against any sort of outside enemy. If Democratic Republicans and the Federalists hate each other and don't trust each other so much, how will we ever then get them to work together if, say, the French attack or the British attack or the Swedish attack or whatever? He was really worried about that and warned the Americans that they should try to figure out a way to get rid of the factions. Good luck with that. His other warning is about foreign policy. He says, let's learn the lesson of what's going on between France and England. Yeah, they're not treating us that well, and that's pretty lousy. But at least we haven't been dragged into their war. Getting dragged into the war would be even worse, because inevitably, as a weak, small country, we would wind up the loser no matter who won, no matter which side we picked. The beautiful thing about Europe is it's really far away. They're going to keep fighting. They're always going to keep fighting. We should assume that they're always going to fight or they will be fighting soon, and we should assume they're always going to want us to be dragged into it. But we've got this big ocean between us and Europe. And that ocean is a buffer that will allow us to stay out of European affairs. What he warns is the U.S. should avoid any kind of entangling engagements, any kind of diplomatic agreements that would force the U.S. to get involved in European wars or get dragged into any of their conflicts. The U.S. should stay neutral, should take advantage of its separation from the major powers of Europe, by not getting dragged into their international problems. And that idea that the US should stay neutral and should stay out of Europe, and by implication, kind of out of the rest of the world, that is the main idea of American foreign policy for the next century. Now, locally, in the Western Hemisphere, the US kind of ignores it in all kinds of ways that we'll be getting to. But looking towards Europe, the US stays out of European affairs, stays out of European wars, manages diplomatically to stay neutral all the way until World War I, and really until World War II is when it's finally over and the US is officially an international power and is going to be involved all over the world. And even that recently has been called into question by some political leaders. So, the U.S. idea of neutrality and even isolationism, that dates back to Washington's ideas in his farewell address of 1796. So that one worked, at least worked for him for a while. He'd be glad, at least for a while, about the lesson learned or the way the country moved in the direction that he wanted. On his other warning, though, the ship had already sailed. As he's writing the farewell address of 1796, the two sides are preparing for the national election that will replace him. And as it turns out, the Federalists united behind one candidate, and the Democratic Republicans united behind another candidate. Not surprisingly, the Democratic Republican candidate is Thomas Jefferson, one of the leading lights of their faction, but also one of the most important men in the country, dating back to the American Revolution, dating back to the Declaration of Independence. He'd been Secretary of State under Washington's cabinet. He had been one of the key intellectual figures. Sure, they're going to support him. You might think the Federalists are going to support Hamilton because most of their ideas came from him, but he personally is so divisive. He's just kind of a jerk. So therefore, although some of the Federalists would prefer he's the candidate, they eventually coalesce behind the candidacy of Vice President John Adams, who, of course, had been Thomas Jefferson's best friend, dating back to those old days when they're writing the Declaration of Independence together, 25 years earlier. Well, here it is, 20 years earlier, 1796, and these are the two candidates of the two factions, and both sides go at each other hammer and tongs, saying all kinds of horrible things about each other. Federalists say you can't vote for that Jefferson guy because if he's elected president, then he's going to change the national language to French, and he's going to put a guillotine in all the towns, and they'll start chopping the heads off the rich people, and it'll be social chaos and disaster. And Democratic Republicans say, well, you can't vote for that Adams guy because he likes the British so much that if he's elected, he's going to crown himself king. We're going to get rid of the republic that we fought so hard for, and we're going to go all the way backwards to the terrible days before the American Revolution. And the scary thing is, they seem like they believe this stuff. Jefferson and Adams, who used to be great friends, are now pointing daggers at each other practically because they both just don't trust the philosophy of each other. And their supporters, the Democratic Republicans, hate the Federalists, and the Federalists hate the Democratic Republicans, and these factions, they seem pretty dug in to me. And Washington is watching this whole thing disintegrate with his head in his hands because he can't believe what's happened to the country. In the end, the election of 1796 is a very close election. The Federalists swept New England and got enough of the mid-Atlantic states, New York and New Jersey mostly, that they were able to get the presidency by a very narrow margin. Jefferson, the Democratic Republican candidate, won the Deep South and won the first couple of Western states that had just been created, but that wasn't enough for him to get an electoral college victory, and therefore the president after Washington will be the former Vice President John Adams. By a quirk in the early Constitution, and they changed this later, the president is the winner of the electoral college, the vice president is the runner-up. So these two guys who represent two very different political philosophies, who had then been going at each other, calling each other terrible names, and their supporters calling each other worse names, somehow Jefferson's got to be Adams' vice president, which is pretty weird. Well, as we move forward in the second part of tonight's lecture, we're going to see what happens with John Adams' presidency. He comes out of 1796 with a very tentative hold on power, and the Federalists tried a few things that proved to be disastrous, and moving forward are going to be pushed out of the way. Jefferson, although he lost that election, we will see, is going to, in the longer run, be the more important because his leadership of his group is going to eventually be dominant in the generation that follows after the Federalist moment. Okay, we'll pick up that story then. Go take a break, enjoy a nice drink or something like that. That's what I plan to do, and then we'll be back soon for part 2 of tonight. Thank you.